Well, here we are in Chapter 25. Chapter 25, we have reached the penultimate chapter for the semester. We just have this one and then Chapter 26, which is diseases of the nervous system. As with the other chapters, since the third exam, I will be posting the study guide for Chapters 25 and 26 separately in the modules along with these recordings so that you will have the tables that delimit the actual diseases you need to know for the next exam. So yellow fever is the first disease listed here. It is called yellow fever because of the jaundice it causes. And we saw jaundice in the digestive system chapter because jaundice is caused when there is liver damage. And yellow fever doesn't get put in with the liver damage, the hepatitis viruses, because it is a hemorrhagic disease. It is damaging much more than just the liver. So yellow fever is a viral hemorrhagic disease that also can cause the liver damage. It can be quite serious and fatal. It is transmitted by a mosquito. So mosquitoes are the most dangerous animal on the planet. There is a vaccine available for yellow fever. The super quick anatomy and physiology of the circulatory and lymphatic systems. They're both in this chapter because they are ways for diseases to become systemic. They might start in a localized region, but because of our circulatory and lymphatic systems covering all components of our bodies, that a localized infection can become systemic if it gains access to either the circulatory or the lymphatic systems. There's our lymphatic system. This is showing the interconnectivity between our circulatory system and the lymphatic system. So microbes that get into one can spread to the other, so it wouldn't be limited to just the circulatory or the lymphatic. It might be both, and that's what helps it to spread systemically throughout our bodies. And the spleen is a lymphatic organ. You can live without your spleen if it's damaged, but it is an important organ in that it is part of our lymphatic system, so part of also our immune system and helping with filtrations. All right. This is showing an individual that has bacterial endocarditis. Clearly, this is from autopsy because if they did this to your heart, they can't glue it back together and put it back in. The damage is called vegetations. Why vegetation? I don't know. It doesn't look like vegetables. It's these clumps of dead bacteria and white blood cells with the inflamed tissues. And so endocarditis, it is inflammation. The cardium, the endocardium, is the internal heart tissue. So inflammation of the endocardium. This disease can happen in various ways. One really terrible and often overlooked way for most people is through oral infections. The bacteria that can accumulate under your gums and on your teeth, if they get systemic, we saw what can happen with periodontal disease where the gum pulls away and the damage from the bacteria can get into that blood system, can end up causing endocarditis. This is an image of a gas gangrene. Gangrene happens when this microbe called Clostridium enters through a puncture wound. It's a very common soil bacterium. It's called gas gangrene because fermentation of the tissues produces gas, which causes inflammation and swelling, and it can also lead to necrosis or the death of the tissue. Tularemia is also called rabbit fever. It doesn't cause illness in the rabbits, but if this microbe gets into cuts or scrapes on a person that are handling rabbits through processing, through butchering, then that disease can become systemic. So there's a hand lesion. These microbes are coccobacillus, so they're not perfect circles, they're not perfect bacilli, they're kind of in between. And this is a microbe where the ID50, the infectious dose 50, that number of microbes necessary to cause an infection or a disease in an individual is extremely low. It doesn't take hundreds or thousands, it can be dozens. Plague. Most of us, when we hear plague, think about the Middle Ages in Europe, where the plague wiped out up to a third of the population. It was really terrible, living amongst our current plague. But in this case, we are talking about bubonic and pneumonic plague, caused by a microbe called Yersinia pestis, because pestilence means plague, literally. It is a gram-negative rod, or a bacillus, and it makes toxins that allow it to invade tissues and cause necrosis, and can actually even spread into the lungs and become pneumonic plague. The bubonic form of plague does respond to antibiotics. Plague is not an ancient disease. It's been around a long time, but there are cases of plague in the United States each year. People usually come into contact from the rodent flea cycle, not necessarily from rats, but from cute little squirrels, chipmunks, ground squirrels, other cute little animals. Those fleas can bite us and can cause the bubonic plague, but if it gets into our lungs, it becomes pneumonic. The bubonic plague can only be spread with that flea bite. The flea delivers the plague bacterium to the mammal that it bites, and then if another flea bites that mammal and delivers it, then the microbe can be spread. It could also be spread in fluids. Pneumonic is airborne. And it's also possible, we can see here, meat consumption. So undercooked meat could deliver bubonic plague to an individual. This is showing the buboes, that is a swollen lymph node, that is why it is called bubonic plague. On the right, obviously a modern picture because it's in color. This is why bubonic plague was also known as Black Death, because of the necrosis it caused on the extremities, on the fingers and the toes. This is looking at a stain of a patient with plague. These are the Yersinia pestis. It's called the safety pin appearance because the center of the cell doesn't stain and the ends do. This is a lung sample. This map shows the distribution of Rocky Mountain spotted fever. And the areas with the greatest incidence are these purple rectangles with the red dots, and you will see that they are not in the Rocky Mountains. They are most prevalent in the southeastern United States. It's called Rocky Mountain spotted fever because it was first described in a lab in the Rocky Mountains. It is caused by an obligate intracellular bacterium, Rickettsia rickettsii, causes Rocky Mountain spotted fever, and it is transmitted by a particular species of ticks. So it's not contagious person to person, but it is infectious and can be spread by tick bites. It's called spotted fever because of this rash. And it's not a skin disease. These rash dots are caused from vascular leakage, from the microbe becoming systemic and causing leakage in the capillaries and causing these red spots on the skin. Those are called petechiae. That's a T. So the vascular leakage is what causes these red dots. This is showing the life cycle of the tick that is responsible for transmitting Lyme disease. And we do have Lyme disease ticks in our area. Let's see if I can get myself out of the way. It's the Ixodes scapularis tick, or the deer tick. It is an extremely tiny tick. The ticks that we most often see that are attached to our dogs, or that we get when we're walking in most pastures or in the forest, are cow ticks, and those are quite large. The deer ticks are extremely tiny. They pick up this microbe, a bacterium called Borrelia burgdorferi. It's a spirochete, so it's a spiral-shaped bacterium. The tick has to be attached about 24 hours to effectively transmit the bacteria to us in high enough numbers. So that's why it's really important to do that tick check if you've been out hiking, if your dog's been out hiking, to make sure that you find any ticks and get them off of you before they attach, or if they attach, that they are removed in less than 24 hours. If you're not sure how long it's been attached, you can always take a tick that you find attached to you, put it in a jar or a Ziploc, and take it to public health. And public health will test that tick to determine if it's carrying Lyme disease or the Rocky Mountain spotted fever, and see if you need to be tested for exposure to those illnesses. But the life cycle involves both the deer, which are the preferred host, and mice, and the different life stages of the tick are involved in these organisms at different stages. But if they get onto us when they are infected with the Borrelia burgdorferi, then they can transmit that illness to us. This is the telltale bullseye rash that results from infection with Lyme disease. It's called bullseye because you have a dark center, you have a clear area, and then another ring. That is because of the life cycle of the spirochete. Where the initial bite of the tick is, there's a concentrated number of those microbes, and where they duplicate, where they multiply, that irritates your immune system, and you get inflammation. That recruitment of various microbes, the cytokine release, and all the things that go along with inflammation. Redness, pain, swelling. And then as the microbes move out, they're in lower numbers, and then they start to multiply again. That replication is what causes the next round of inflammation. Not everyone sees this rash. If it happens on your back, on your scalp, on a part of your body that you cannot easily see, or if it's not this obvious, you can actually miss this rash. This is showing the microbes actually in a big clump under a dark field micrograph, so they stay in the background and light up the little microbes. They are quite large, as you can see. It can attack joints and can cause autoimmune reactions. That's why it's important to be tested and detect the disease early. If it's caught early, antibiotics can eliminate this microbe from your system. If it has spread too far from that initial site, it can become indeed systemic and attack the joints and cause a full body autoimmune response. So there's a deer tick that's not attached to the skin. It's really tiny. This is not a deer tick. It's really big. The best tool for removing ticks is, it looks like a teaspoon, but it has this little V-shaped notch that gets right underneath the head of the tick and pulls it out. If you're using tweezers, you're not supposed to twist at all. You're supposed to pull just straight up. All right. Puerperal sepsis is a disease that happens because of pregnancy during delivery. And it happens when bacteria infect the uterus and the surrounding tissues. It's also known as postpartum infection. The signs and symptoms can show up right with delivery or up to 42 days later. Super fast onset of fever, shock, and death. The most common causative agent is Streptococcus pyogenes, although Staph aureus can be involved. And up to 10% of pregnancy-related deaths in the U.S. are due to this puerperal sepsis. Rheumatic fever is not an infection in and of itself. It's actually the immune response to a previous infection with Streptococcus pyogenes. And usually it's because of strep throat. And the antibodies to surface proteins on those microbes cross-react with heart tissue. That means the antibodies that were very specific to proteins on the surface of the streptococci also have a similar enough shape to proteins on the heart valves. And so that's what a cross-reaction means. It was intended for one protein, but it's a close enough structural match that it actually attacks another protein. So that would be an autoimmune response, because you're responding to self-proteins. The prevention is the rapid diagnosis and treatment of strep throat and streptococcal impetigo with antibiotics. Some folks don't get treatment because they're lucky enough that their strep throat or impetigo kind of resolves on its own, and that's fine for that disease. But if the infection lasted a little longer because it wasn't treated with antibiotics, then those antibodies have built up to a higher degree, and there's that risk of the rheumatic fever. So the treatment of the rheumatic fever is still antibiotics because there might still be streptococci around. That should be anti-inflammatories. I'll correct that, not inflammatories. And anticonvulsants if it is attacking the nervous system and causing problems in that area. This table, like the other chapters for exam 4, contains far more diseases than I've gone over or that you'll be responsible for. So the chapter 25 study guide on Canvas, it's still extensive, I realize that, but it is not 2 full pages of diseases, bacterial infections of the lymphatic system. Viral diseases. This first one is Burkitt's lymphoma, caused by Epstein-Barr virus. It can cause large tumors of the jaw. And what we see on the right are the abnormally shaped lymphocytes, and that can spread through the circulatory and lymphatic systems in patients infected with Epstein-Barr virus. Now, here we have this cute little keyhole-shaped virus that is Ebola. The size bar tells us it's extremely tiny. 100 nanometers is 0.1 micrometers, so it's 1/10 the size of an E. coli. It's a filamentous virus because it looks like a filament. Causes a hemorrhagic or internal bleeding fever. The mortality rate is greater than 50%. And it's spread by direct contact with the infected fluids. So where Ebola outbreaks happen, as soon as extreme PPE measures are put into place so that persons who are infected or dying from this disease can be handled with care and without the caregiver coming into contact with the fluids, that is what stops the spread of the virus. We have HIV in this chapter as well. We saw it with immune system diseases because it doesn't infect CD4 positive T cells, but since it does infect lymphocytes that spread through the lymphatic system, and untreated HIV can certainly affect many body systems, it also appears in this chapter. So the green is the HIV, and it is budding from the lymphocyte. This is from 2019, so it's relatively recent, showing worldwide prevalence of HIV in adults, and by adults they've defined that in persons aged 15 to 49. There probably are persons younger than 15 who are infected. There are certainly many people over 49, but this is showing primarily that age group. The global prevalence is 0.7% of the population, but we can see that sub-Saharan Africa is greater than 10% of the population has been infected, and Africa is the hardest hit continent by far, and there are other areas where there is reasonably high infection rates. That used to be much worse. In the last decade, the deaths from HIV infection have dropped by half, and that has to do primarily with treatments for the disease, keeping the replication at low levels so that persons can live longer, healthier lives while still being infected. We, to date, don't have any cures that aren't pretty dramatic. The two known cures of HIV were in persons that were infected with both HIV and had leukemia. So they had their immune systems destroyed by radiation and received a bone marrow transplant with from a person that had a mutation in a receptor on the T cells. Otherwise, HIV treatment involves reducing the viral load so that the immune system continues to function, and the persons who are infected with HIV don't succumb to AIDS, which means depletion of their immune system. And this is just looking at that clinical progression of our CD4 T cells, the blue line. Initially, we've got lots of them. This hash mark means it varies from person to person, how many weeks to how many years that dramatic decline in the CD4 T cells happen. The red line is the viral load. So very low initially, it spikes, and as the CD4 T cells decrease in numbers, the viral load is increasing. Again, we've got 2 pages of viral diseases, but I do have the somewhat shorter list of diseases on that Chapter 25 study guide that will be in Canvas for you.